So welcome everyone to our little play reading Q&A session for you all. A huge thank you to everyone who's watching and a huge thank you to everyone on the panel. I'm so grateful for you all for giving up your evening to do this today. It's going to be excellent. So this is the second sort of shared learning resource that we've put together for you all. This is for the play reading group, and the idea is that we've all got a wide range of experiences, and why not learn from each other on them. I'm always keen for more suggestions, so if you have them, please let me know. I'd love to hear them. Now, in terms of our panel today, I'm so excited. I think it's fantastic that you're all doing this, and it's such a diverse range of backgrounds, so it's going to be really good. So first up, we have Andy Hutchings. He has been writing plays for the stage for over a decade. He is writer in residence for Electric Fables, and specialises in science fiction on stage and likes to run group storytelling exercises with fellow writers. We also have Casey Finn. She is a multi-award-winning novelist who writes primarily for young adult audiences. She is also a published poet and has written and directed several theatre shows in and around her hometown of Chester. And then lastly, we have Baz Stilinski, who studied film and media at degree level, which kickstarted his script writing. He won a special NODA award for his first two-act play, Hey Lil Man. Cool. So now that we are ready, our very first question today. If there's no such thing as a new idea, where do you get ideas from? Andy, can I get your thoughts on that one, please?
Sure. I think it's a valid concern, a valid point about there not being original ideas. Even the classics that we know when we look at plays like Oedipus Rex and Shakespeare in particular are kind of riffing on existing stories. It's an easy trap when you're writing, I think, to compare what you're doing to what other people have done anyway. So if your story's got similarities to other people's stories, that's kind of amplified a bit. The best thing I can really say about coming up with ideas and worrying about the originality of them is that if everything's a remix anyway, then lean into it, you know, watch what other people are doing and ask yourself, well, how would I do it differently? You know, how would I change the ending if I were writing it? How would I develop this character if I were doing it? And start from there. A lot of good writers got their start in fan fiction. And in fact, there are probably several examples, including the very obvious one of people writing fan fiction and then kind of making it more and more and more their own thing until all of a sudden it is their own thing. It is their own thing. It's, you know, maybe you can still see the DNA strands with what it's fan fiction of, but it's their own thing. And a good place to start with a story is looking at other stories that you've enjoyed and going, well, how would I do it? One of the last few plays I wrote in the last couple of years was called The Chinese Room, and a lot of the ideas of that came from a Star Trek episode, which I love. It's one of my favourite Star Trek episodes, and I kind of started going with the ideas of that and go, well, how would I explore them? How would I try out this idea? Until eventually it became something that was an original idea to me that wasn't affiliated with Star Trek in any way. So don't worry about your idea not being the most original thing in the world. There may not be a concept of that.
Great, thank you, Andy. Casey, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think I totally agree, obviously, with what Andy's saying, that there's no point in trying to reinvent the wheel, because the wheel exists and we all know the wheel. But I think there's a beauty in that of people expecting certain things because they know story and they know narrative. So if you have an audience that comes in expecting a certain thing, as Andy rightly says, you can lean into that and you can then subvert it and try and find surprises and twists that do make it your own. So if somebody comes in expecting, you know, a traditional setup of a romantic comedy and you start giving them those story beats and then suddenly, you know, a dead body drops and it becomes a murder mystery, in the middle of it, there's something really rewarding in the subversion of the traditional. So yeah, I think absolutely you can make it work for you. And as somebody who primarily writes like quite a lot of dark stuff and horror things, I like to find very pleasant tropes and those kind of ideas and then think, well, how can I ruin this? for people? How can I make this as dark as possible? So yeah, I think it's all there to be utilized, and originality is in the work and the craft that you put into it with your style and your voice, not necessarily what the idea was to begin with.
Right. I think earlier then you mentioned story beats. Would you mind elaborating what that means, just for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, sure. So if you take the romantic comedy as a prime example, your first official sort of story beat in that, which is an element that you would expect to happen in the plot, would be what they call the meet cute, which is where your primary figures that are going to be in the romance will meet for the first time. Perhaps they just bump into each other in a shop, or one of them runs into the other one's car. You know, so and story beats are those pivotal turning points and moments in a script or a film or any kind of story where we have the progression of the relationship and the plot.
That's great, thank you. And Baz, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, what Andy and Casey said is absolutely spot on, but the way I approach it as well is like, yes, there's no new genres, they are there setting ground, but I think inspiration and imagination of what you have will always delve into that and give those twists and surprises, especially what Casey says. It's like, yeah, romantic comedy, but in Dead Body, I want to read that and see that, absolutely, because that's my sort of thing. But if you can twist those things that you wouldn't expect, it's like if you see a film and you think, I would have done that differently, but why don't they do that? That's your inspiration and your imagination. And you're creating something else, a new story that other people may not have expected. So go along with that. Go with the instinct of what you like as imagination and inspiration, and you do create new stories, if not new genres, but it does become a new idea. So absolutely.
That's great, thank you. For our second question, and this was sent in by Hannah. How detailed a plan do you tend to do before you start writing? Do you ever wing it / plan less or more for some projects? Casey, would you mind answering this one first?
Yeah, no problem. I have a varied approach to it because I'm fairly organic with my writing. I'm not somebody who has a set routine. I don't do any of those like go off to the garden shed to write or have a specific time of day. So it can be very much down to the project and how the mood takes me. But I do wing it a lot. I like to wing it. I like to have the freedom of throw it all on the page, initially at least. Like, because I write novels as well as plays, you have a lot of time to muck about at the beginning of a novel when you're setting up. You have maybe 10, 15,000 words of setup in a 100,000 word novel. So especially when I'm doing that, I will just write, and some of those chapters might not even make it in because I decide that the story hasn't really started yet and I've just waffled and that all needs to go. But it gives you that freedom to do it. With plays, I do find that I tend to know the arc of the story, the progression of sort of beginning, middle, end, maybe some of the particular beats that I was talking about, those scenes that I feel would be essential that need to happen in it, especially if you're following a particular genre. So I wrote a murder mystery a couple of years ago, and it was my first attempt at sort of a spoof Agatha Christie version of a 1920s mystery. And I mean, you know that you need to have the moment where they discover the body. You need to have the big moment where the detective arrives. You need to have the moment where everybody sits down in the room and the detective marches around and explains what they think is going on. You know, if you have a genre that you're trying to stick to in particular, it can be quite easy to get some semblance of structure going from the beginning.
That's great, thank you. And Andy, any thoughts?
I kind of have a strategy that I do for planning, and it's one that I adapt on the fly an awful lot. So when I've kind of got that core idea for a project, what I'll start to do is kind of like lay down layers for it. So I'll kind of take the core idea and go, okay, well, how will this fit over a 5-act structure? And then go, okay, well, then what needs to happen in this act, then this one and this one? And then, okay, now what scenes need to happen for all of these things to happen in it? And then by the time I get down to that scene level, I'll have like a list of bullet points for the beats, as Casey explained a moment ago, that a scene needs to pass through before it gets to the end. And then I will sit down and I will write the scene, and I will kind of write the dialogue moving from one of those beats to the next one. That's not to say it's a rigid plan. Usually after a couple of scenes in, I'm going back to the bullet points for later scenes and going, oh, okay, now this is how, now I need to accommodate this, and this is going to change how this happens. It's a plan that you've got to adapt on the fly. But I think any strategy that you've got for your writing needs to be one that you adapt on the fly, because sometimes you're writing a scene and an idea will suddenly bubble up based on the way you phrased something, or a character will start kind of moving in a particular direction that doesn't quite fit the plan you've got, but you go, oh, actually, I like this more. And you've got to explore that, and you've got to try that out, and that will involve revising the plan. So as much as you're going to redraft the finished script when you're done with it, you've got to be redrafting the plan constantly as you're writing it.
Great, thank you. Baz, any thoughts?
I really hope none of my students are listening to this, because I will say plan, 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 move towards my mind maps, visualization. I teach all that. I don't do it myself. I'm really quite bad. When you are writing something, while you should plan, for those students that are watching, I think you can invest it in it as well. So you know those arcs you're talking about. You know your beginning, middle, and end. I don't think you can write a script or a story without knowing those to begin with. You know, while I do have a sense of winging it along, I know what's going to happen, sort of thing. And what I like about winging it as well is, like, you can develop characters that you may not have anticipated. But you're right, there are different drafts, etc. It's like, I've written a script multiple times, because every time I go back to it, I don't like how it's developed, because I think other ideas and stuff like that. But if you are really invested, I can write and write and write and be so happy with it because it's accumulated, but I had those arcs and beats along the way. So yes, you do need to plan. How efficiently you are, I think you can give that to your own merit, because while I tell my students you should do these things, if you have those beats and those arcs of what's going to happen and ideal scenes that you thought about, or those lines that you think would be perfect, you will fit them in there where you think you know best. And that investment is probably a good planning quality.
That's great, thank you. So next question, how do you start writing? Any tips for that dreaded writer's block? And Andy, if you could fill this one first.
Writer's block, which probably most commonly occurs when you are starting writing, when you're trying to find that first perfect line from which the rest of the story will flow, is a wall that ultimately the only way past it is to smash through it. I find I am like KC in that I do not buy into the idea of I can only write when I've got my particular blend of herbal tea and the sun is in the right place and the stars are just in the right position and now I can write. You've just got to put your shoulder to the wheel and start and get doing it. Writer's block, in my experience, happens when nothing that you're coming up with feels like it's good enough. Either the ideas that you've got in your head don't feel good enough to bother putting them down on the page, or what you are putting down on the page doesn't feel good enough to bother clicking save and carrying on with it later, because why keep working on it, because it's obviously hot garbage. You've just got to write it anyway. You've got to write it anyway. And if you're worrying now that it's crap, then write it anyway, and then write the stuff that comes after, which is less crap. And then at the end of it, once you've got the whole thing down, you can come back to that bit that you stumbled on, the bit that gave you writer's block. And you can, first of all, you can ask yourself, is it as bad looking back at it as I thought it was at the time? And 99.9% of the time, no. It may not be brilliant, it may not be Wordsworth, but it will never be as bad as you feel like it is in the moment. And even if it is, well, I can fix it now. I can rewrite, I can edit, I can do a new draft in which I fix this problem now. So you've got to get into that mentality of just get it down and fix it later if you need to. Because if you get hung up on, well, I can't write chapter 4 whilst chapter 3 is such a hot mess, then you're never going to write chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, the rest of it's not going to happen. And those could be gold dust that kind of put this chapter 3 in a whole new light. So just get it down. If it's crap, it's crap. Deal with it later.
Brilliant, thank you. Baz, any thoughts?
Yeah, writer's block. I generally think you get writer's block if you plan when to write. I do it for fun. It's a hobby that I really enjoy. It's not my job per se, but you know, if I say I'm going to write tomorrow, and then I'm like, I don't know what to write, or you're writing it, as Andy says, you know you're writing crap. and I just know I'm going to delete it straight after. If that's the case, what I generally do, the best way I get ideas for writer's block is I go and do something that's got nothing to do with writing. I walk the dog, or I have a bath or something. And generally I'm fine, I'm relaxed, whatever. And then those ideas come back, and then go back when you've got those ideas and write them. They can still be crap, but those ideas are out there, and you can go back and then, as Andy says, you redraft it, you know, to like make some more sense, or get someone to read it and give them your thoughts. You know, don't be afraid to get constructive criticism, because that's a great tool, I think, because they're being honest with your friends. You know, if it doesn't make sense, they'll tell you. If it still sounds crap, you need to go for another walk and think about it. But if I have writer's block, I do something that's not writing, so I can clear my mind, and then I'll get those ideas. And I generally think that works. But don't plan. If you say, unless you've got deadlines for a job, that's different. But I do it for fun. If I say I must write by tomorrow, it won't work. I you know, do it when it's ready. You'll know when it's right.
Great, thank you. Casey, any thoughts?
Well, certainly about to offer a slightly alternative approach, although I agree with many of the points. And I think it's definitely in finding something that's right for you. But I write full time for a living, and I have deadlines, and I have enormous amounts of words, thousands and thousands of words to write every week. So I very much agree that if you put too much pressure on yourself, that is completely defeating. Especially, you know, I suffer with a few different medical conditions. I have some long-term conditions, so you can wake up in the morning and nothing is working right. Your brain's not working right, your body's not even working right. You can't get out of bed for a start, and you think, oh my goodness, how am I going to write 5,000 words today that's due on this particular thing? Or how am I going to do 10 editorials that I need to write today? You know, whatever my particular job is that's in my diary. And my diary is always full of stuff that I should be doing. I think you need to be flexible and realistic in your approach, certainly to the amount of time that you have, and allow for some contingency times where, if it's not working and you don't feel that it's working, that there's another time later in the week that you maybe allocate as a catch-up point, so that if you do get blocked, you don't think, oh well, this was my only afternoon to write. You know, make sure there's some contingency time, because I usually find that I put contingency time in later in the week, and I might get to Friday at about 11 in the morning and go, I'm done, I finished my list for the week, and I'm like, oh, Friday off, lovely, you know. Because if I've had a productive week and I don't need that time, it's really handy. It's ironic because I've been writing a lot of educational courses. I do a lot of writing about writing for a company called Highbrow, and I recently produced a course for them that will be available next month, I think, which is about maintaining focus and motivation. And I was so unfocused and unmotivated whilst I was trying to write this course, giving advice to other people about motivation. And it really made me take my own advice, because I'm trying to say, well, you know, these are things that I do. If I'm finding it difficult to type, I might change to voice dictation in order to make life easier for myself and have a different learning format, have a different expression. And then I thought, well, maybe if I'm struggling with this course, I should get my microphone out and take my own advice. And then suddenly wrote 2,000 or 3,000 words of the course. So, you know, it can be about being creative in your approach, but also not super hard on yourself, and giving yourself plenty of time and space to create.
Brilliant, thank you. I feel like there's some nice differences in the answers there, actually, so hopefully that's lots for people to think about. Next question, what advice do you have for finding unique voice for your characters? Casey, can I give it on to you?
Yeah, sure. This is quite interesting for me, and I believe it probably will be for Andy as well, although I don't think he has this tendency as much as I do. But because we work with an established group of actors in Electric Fables in particular, sometimes you know who you're writing for and who you would like to have a particular role in a script. And that lends itself enormously for me to the kind of characters that I want to create, because I can already hear the voice of the actor, not necessarily their natural voice, but I can imagine, because I've seen them perform a lot, how they will perform it. So there's a lot of flexibility in there, especially when you know you have people who are great at making particular types of speeches or are natural comedians, and there are things, inflections that you can put in there and you think, oh, if he says that in his voice, that's going to be that's going to be a belter. You know, that's that's going to take the roof off, because people will laugh just purely because you know that person. I don't do it so much with novels, and I think there's a little bit of a crossover here, because I think people will have different approaches again on this. But I sometimes tend to cast plays or novels with celebrities. I'll pick an actor that I think would be good for that role and sort of think about their voice and try and say those lines of dialogue in their voice, in their accent. And I feel that lends a lot of uniqueness to different parlances and different ways of speech if you try not to have it all coming from your voice. I mean, I've been known, because I live alone, thank goodness, because I've been known to read scripts in totally different accents and voices for all of the different actors that I've cast in it, and go, does this sound right? Are these voices going to gel? You know, so yes, we sound a bit mad in practice, but it usually works out in the final product, I find.
Perfect. Baz, any thoughts?
I'm glad Casey went first, because I thought my answer made me sound mad, but actually say I visualize. It sounds really weird, but I get the idea. I mean, with plays, I've directed plays and you cast people in your head how I might do it. I understand that, absolutely. But when you're writing things that's not a play, maybe it's like a TV script or something, I kind of visualize how I would watch it on television. I generally use people that I know or who I think the character might look like, but it doesn't mean they're dead apart. But I kind of like, you know, it's really weird. I can visualize people I met in the street as being the character, and I just kind of play out the script in my head like it's a TV program, which sounds really bizarre and like, what's he talking about? But I do it loads, and I do it when I'm not reading my scripts. I do it when, like I say, walking the dog and having that imagination free, and I can like kind of think of stuff, and I can see me. And sometimes I start talking the script itself, and it's like people think I'm mad. But I think with it being a unique voice, etc., I think your imagination is part of that. So your imagination has got to be part of that process. So yeah, you are going to visualize, and I love the idea of celebrities. That's great. I might try it next time, Casey. I love that idea. But I visualize people I know, so I've got a way of what they look like. But I visualize their sounds differently, as like a TV series, and I always have those cliffhanger moments or all those scene breaks, stuff like that, which just come naturally to me, because that's, you know, TV's part of my life, you know, so I find that easier. But yeah, I think the imagination process is the way to go forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And Andy, your thoughts?
I was going to say the same thing. Cast it. As far as writing a play goes, I used to have a terrible problem back in my student days of writing, when I first really started writing plays proper, in that a lot of my characters would sound the same regardless of age or gender or everything else, because as I was writing it, I was reading it all out loud myself to see how it sounded, and it all sounded great in my voice, but I'm not playing every single character. Most of the time I'm not even playing one of them, so it's weird to do that. Whereas if you do like fantasy casting for it, different people sound different. And anyone who's watched this video this far will notice that the four of us sound different, not just in terms of like pitch and stuff and accent in our voices, but we phrase things differently, we word things differently. It's part of our background. And a line that sounds really good when spoken by Sean Bean would sound really weird when read aloud by Judi Dench. So by casting it like that and writing for this kind of like fantasy cast that you're going to have for it, you can have characters phrase stuff in a way that would suit a character played by David Tennant rather than a character like 10 characters all played by me. And also, just to expand on it, it's because Kim mentioned that she and I have an established group of actors that we kind of work with regularly, and it does help to kind of know the voices that it might end up working with. But for the most part, I try to use people who are obviously never going to actually be in it, because if I write it for my friend Rob, and then Rob's not available to perform it, it's going to sound weird and it's not going to work. And whoever gets that part eventually is going to frankly do a less good job of it if it was written with Rob in mind. So the one time I have written for a group like that is when I was given 5 actors and told we need a 1-act play for them. So I got the cast before I had the script or even the concept. And I got to say, when I was writing that was one of the easiest writing experiences of my life, especially with writing comedy, because I know what sounds funny out of each of their mouths, so I could write comedy that worked with the comedy performers doing it. Because the kind of jokes that David Walliams doesn't work as well with Ramesh Ranganathan. So you have to know, with comedy in particular, it really helps to know who's going to be saying it, because you know what their timing is like, you know what their facial expressions are like, you know what their voice is like. So, but yeah, in terms of finding a unique voice, yeah, cast it. To summarise that entire ramble in a sentence.
Perfect, thank you. Next question was, to what extent do you detail set and staging, etc.? How do you balance communicating your vision with giving freedom to directors, actors, and the rest of the creative team?
Okay.
Andy, can I give it on to you?
Yeah, sure can. Yes. There is a balance that you need to walk with stage directions, I've found, because if you're far too prescriptive, then directors aren't going to want to do the script, because they're not going to be able to put their own stamp on it. They're not going to be able to make it different from the other productions of it, so why would they bother? But at the same time, I found if you're too vague in stage directions, you get a whole lot of phone calls from directors and actors asking you what the hell. Well, he mentions at this point that they goes off and sit down, there aren't any chairs on the set. Well, put one on. So yeah, I try to kind of find a middle ground and keep it to things that have relevance to what the characters are saying and doing. So if they talk about, do you want a cup of coffee, mention in the stage directions at the start that there's a coffee set on the stage or something like that. But try not to get into, I can't remember who it was, but there's a script I read where every other sentence there was another stage direction saying, she goes over here, she leans slightly, she sits down and stuff. Why would you ever direct that other than to ignore the stage directions? Because they've directed it for you, basically. So try to leave enough wiggle room for directors to make it different. If there's room for two different people to read it and then stage it in different ways while still making sense as a play, I think that's a good thing to be aiming for in terms of stage directions.
Great, thank you. Baz, your thoughts?
I think you kind of got to take a back seat a little bit as well. I mean, if you've written something and someone else is directing it, then yes. I mean, when I write plays, my stage directions are minimal because firstly, you don't know what limitations they have on their stage, etc., what budgets they have for a set, etc. So you know, if you're too prescriptive, you're short selling your play to begin with because you're minimizing what they can and can't do. Also, I think when actors take on characters, they become those characters and they might see it a different way as you've written it. And sometimes that's quite a nice thing, you know, it's because it's a different thought process of how that character becomes. So if they want to lean a certain way or walk a certain way, I don't think you can be that prescriptive in a script for a play anyway. Otherwise, you might as well direct it yourself because you're taking ownership of it. So, you know, give those actors that artistic freedom, give directors that artistic freedom because it's their vision from what something you've written. And I think it's a lovely process, you know, because watching something you've written that you think, oh, I quite like that approach, you may not see it. It's brilliant, you know. And the beauty of that as well, you could do a play and say a local group could do it and do it one way, but another group could do it a different way because of a different interpretation. And how fantastic is that? Because, you know, your script is that viable, and, you know. And so, yeah, I don't be prescriptive. Let them take control. It's their baby now, you know. I think let them go with it. Don't have stage directions, but don't be detailed because, you know, what's the point? It's you just minimize what they can do.
Fantastic, thank you. And Casey?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm very much of the Shakespeare principle of no stage direction, if you can help it. Exit pursued by a bear, because the bear is important, so it needs to be there. But, you know, other than that, leave them off as much as possible. I feel, as Andy says, for the mechanics of some directors, you do have to sort of have some kind of guidance, particularly if there's things that might be prop heavy that's relevant. So it's handy, having been a stage manager as well as director and writing and acting on stage through all different times in my theatre life. For a stage manager, it's particularly important that you have props foregrounded, and if there's important things that are supposed to be set, it's really useful for them that you have that in the script at the opening of different scenes, or that so and so comes on with a tray containing blah blah and blah, you know. So there are things that you can do that make it useful for a cast without over directing from sort of this backseat position as a writer. But I agree, when it comes to character expression and movement, you might decide to say, oh, like Andy said, you know, she sits, she slumps, she leans in this particular way, but their set may not account for that, or the director might feel that their organic movement, that she happens to be standing at this point in a completely different place on the stage. And when I have directed other people's plays, I will read the stage directions and I have some indication of, okay, they sort of want them to move like that, but if I feel characters are emoting in a particularly different way, or just if they look better on the confines of the type of stage that you have by putting them in a different position, you as a director are going to completely ignore those stage directions. So as a writer, you ought to be prepared for that, I think. Absolutely. Even in things where you can be more prescriptive, like in writing novels where you're actually narrating every movement and every moment of physical description, every moment of physical motion, people will still come back with a completely different reading of your characters and totally different interpretations of those scenes. So, you know, over the years, I've learned to absolutely let that go, because people will gloss over the parts that don't fit with their interpretation and their enjoyment of your work. And why should they? Because it's an artistic form. You put your art out there and they respond to it in a completely different and usually completely unexpected way. And I think as a writer, you've got to be prepared to be free and generous with that. So stage directions is a good place to start letting go in that way.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Next question, how do you get your plays performed, and what obstacles can writers expect to face in doing so? I imagine, given you've both got your own companies that you work with, it might be a slightly different take on things to maybe what Baz will have. So if it's okay, Baz, can I ask you first, and then I'll go to Andy and Casey?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite lucky because I'm part of a local Amjam group, so they're very accepting of new talent and stuff like that, so they will try things. I mean, normally I write a play, the process goes to a committee meeting, they either approve it or don't approve it. They do approve it, then it's like, are you directing it, or who's going to direct it? And it's that process. So I mean, I am lucky. I have those contacts that I can get plays performed, and not everyone has that. So I mean, it's a very interesting and controversial way of doing it. Like, do you give plays for free to get noticed, or you know, or should be paid for them? I mean, the way I do it, I'm part of this Amjam group. I do it for the love of writing. I do it for love of performing. Don't get paid anything for it. That's, you know, I'm not saying that's the right answer, because if it's a job, you need to get paid for it. That license money is really important, you know, because you can't survive without it. But my point of view, it's a hobby, you know, a hobby that will hopefully go well for me. So I have those contacts, and I'm quite willing, please take my play, put my name out there. I want people to see my work. But 5 years down the line, that could be a different story. And, you know, why am I not being paid for something if I'm getting recognized for something, or, you know, I've won an award for something, so there must be some substantiality in my plays. So why not? It's a tricky question. I say, get a name for yourself. If that's giving your plays free to people that you know at the junction of your heart, but then start, you know, you're gonna have to start charging, or think about how you do it. Do you get an agent? Do you? So, I mean, another way I've done recently is like submitting towards competitions, like recognized that way. I think get recognized first, which could be a long process, or, you know, a quick process. But, you know, yes, writing is a hobby, but if you are doing it for others to perform and making money off you, you should eventually make money from that as well.
Great, thank you. Casey?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in the discussion resonating from what Baz is saying. I was fortunate coming into playwriting in some extent that I already had a name for myself and a few awards under my belt as a novelist, because people had an interest in encouraging me, like, oh, you write novels. Do you do plays too? Would you like to do plays? You know, and so, but I started out in a very similar area in amateur dramatics. When I moved to my current hometown in Chester, that was one of the first things that I did, because the theatre was at the end of my street where I moved in, and I thought, well, why not? This is something that I love. I'd been in youth theatre, you know, I'd done independent films and dramatic projects and things like that when I was younger, and I thought, yeah, this is something that I'd like to get back into. And initially they were very supportive of new talent and something original and seeing what that could offer. And, you know, I did some stuff to experiment with coming into playwriting in the first instance. So the first, you know, we did short showcases where I might just write a sketch or a monologue, performing them myself or directing one or two other people. So as Baz says, you start out small and you start to get a little local reputation of, oh, you write really good sketches. Can I be in one of your comedy sketches next time? You know, and things like that. And it builds from there. By the time that I did the first sort of full-length production, it's a cynical old world, but it does sort of come down to money and licensing and valuing your art to some degree. Because when I realized how much money had been turned over for a show that I had put hundreds of hours into writing and directing, and the actors themselves had put so much in, and of course amateur dramatics is a charity, and you think, well, I've done something in order to keep this group going and to make funds so that this group can happen. But there can be a slippery slope, I think, of being taken advantage of, that it becomes an expectation that you will always do it for free. And I mean, licensing is not something that you're going to make a fortune on as a playwright, especially if, you know, only one place is purchasing a license from you maybe every 6 months, maybe every 12 months to put your play on. It's not a huge money-making thing at all, unless you've got a license for a 6-month run in the West End, you know. So to be compensated even by a small amount for a license at the beginning, or a small share of tickets, even 10%, is a courtesy to say to the writer, I value your art. Because ultimately the writing is the foundation. The director has nothing to direct and the actors have nothing to act if you have not produced a script. So there's definitely something to be valued in that. As Baz says, competitions are also a really good area. I've had some successes and some fun things that have happened internationally as a result of entering things into those. Ultimately for me though, working independently and putting my shows on independently has been the absolute best experience, because it's a case of like facilities versus freedom. If you don't mind being in a black box or in a room above a pub to put something on, but you've put it on in the best way that's possible, and even if you just make your costs back in that case, and it's all been of your own design with a team that you've put together that you trust, that there's nothing better in the world than that for me.
Brilliant, thank you. And Andy?
Yeah, I mean, just building on what KC said, really, the reason that Electric Fables kind of came into being is that the amateur group that myself and KC and some others were part of had some capacity for new writing in the form of showcases and small stuff downstairs, but because amateur groups live and die on people they can get through the door buying tickets, and what sells is established plays that everyone has heard of, there was a lot of resistance to putting new writing on and kind of like the main stage as a, you know, a centerpiece of the season, which, you know, I get it. That's fair enough. They've got to think of this from a business point of view. So I try not to begrudge them that. I try. So yeah, Electric Fables, because Electric Fables doesn't have a venue to be paying the upkeep of, we are just a group who we are still amateurs, we are still doing this for the love of the game, but it gives us a lot more freedom. And in terms of how to get your plays performed, just going back to the wording of the original question there, if you're not going to be the sort of writer who writes and then sends it off to all the opportunities on the BBC Writers' Room page and then waits 6 months to hear a maybe back or whatever, you've got to start doing it yourself. You've got to roll your sleeves up and do it yourself. once you've been in Amdram for a while, you'll find that you know quite a few actors, directors, techies, and even venues. So you've just got to start making calls, and you've got to be your own producer until you're influential enough to have people producing it for you, which will probably be a while if my experience is anything to go by. But it's worth the legwork. It really is.
I think we'll have to do a whole session on how to be your own producer. It'd be really interesting to get some feedback on. So another question, software, hardware, etc. What essential items are in your writer's toolkit? Andy, can I give that to you first?
In terms of like the true essentials for writing, ink, paper. I think if you start getting up hung up on the idea of writing on a MacBook Air in a coffee shop, or you're really hipster about it and you just got to use a typewriter or it doesn't count, then you're really kind of missing the point. It's about the stories that you're telling with whatever tools you use. So I use a piece of software called Writer Duet because I find it's very robust script editing, and I hate having to format on Microsoft Word. So I use that because it's cloud-based, so I can dabble on it on my phone or on my work computer as and when I get a moment to do so. But in terms of the essentials, like I say, ink and paper. Everything after that is a wonderful cherry on top. But
that's great, thank you. Casey?
Yeah, I'm glad you went to Andy first to talk about software, because I know that there are many, many wonderful software programs out there that I probably should be using to produce my scripts, but I don't. I format everything myself very laboriously in Microsoft Word, just because as well as being a writer, I co-run a small publishing company, and I do all of the formatting as a matter of course for novels. So formatting doesn't bother me. It gives me time to sort of percolate over what I've been writing and to notice mistakes and that kind of thing. So it's kind of part of my sort of editing ritual for scripts that I'm happy to go through and format. So I don't really have any particular like software requirements. The best advice I could probably give in terms of what you should have in your writer's toolkit is a comfortable space. And I don't necessarily mean that you should like a lounge on the couch for 4 hours whilst you're trying to crack out a section of a script, because I personally would get up from that and be so crippled that I wouldn't be able to function for the rest of the day. You know, I think having a good lighting, you know, you need to be keenly aware to sort of take care of your physical health whilst you're writing, because it's a deceptively draining process. So if you haven't got good backlighting and you're just working from the screen of a laptop with that light going into your eyes, that's intense, especially if you're going to put in the amount of hours that you need to write a full-length play script, or to write multiple scripts, you know, on a regular basis, if that's what you're going for. The same, I have terrible trouble with my back anyway, so I'm always very, very conscious about posture and those kind of things. There's nothing, I think we were joking earlier about having a particular kind of herbal tea and stuff like that, and I think if that suits you, then that's great. If that's something that boosts you and makes you feel like you can write more with it, then by all means consider it part of your toolkit as part of like self-care generally around being a writer, that you're not sort of forcing yourself into an uncomfortable position, because you'll never do the best that you can creatively. So it's, yeah, whatever works for you, but also don't start relying on them as your like lucky rabbit's foot, that you must have those conditions as well. So yeah, there's a fine line between it. I mean, the other essential thing for me when I work is I turn my phone off. I put everything on silent. I put my laptop on silent. I don't have any notifications going on in the background, and my phone on silent. And I'll text somebody 3 hours later and say, sorry, I was writing. Because I think it's important to acknowledge that it's, you know, a process. It's work. Even if you're doing it as a hobby, it's hard work. So for other people to appreciate that you need your writing space and your silent time during that, that's basically the main things that I need, is comfort and silence in my toolkit.
Brilliant, thank you. And Baz?
I'm quite lazy. I use software. I use Celtex, formats it for you. Only because we were taught that when I was studying, but I liked it. It would do either stage plays formats or script formats of films, etc. So it's quite easy. Downside, spelling mistakes aren't always notified for you, so you do have to proofread it, etc. But like I said, you should be going through your scripts anyway after you've written them, checking that. Agree with Andy, ink and pad of paper. I have a small jotter's pad just for ideas, you know. That could be ground for the scene you're writing or a different play later on. So I constantly come up with weird ideas in my head for no reason at all. So jot them down, you know. So a little pad of pen to write those down. But I do use software. I use my Mac to write on. Weirdly to Casey, I have to have music and distractions. I don't know why. I agree with you. A lot of people say you need silence, but I think the way I work, because I think if I have music playing, then I come accustomed to it, and then distractions don't distract me, if that makes sense. Probably the back to front. If it's complete silence, things will distract me more. But I appreciate, Casey, you know, that's your job, and while you write for hobbies, it's a job as well. In my mind, if I can be distracted quite easily, I don't write. But if I've got music playing, and if someone texts me halfway through, I'll answer and be, oh, I'm writing. And I kind of show off, you know, that I'm writing, and that kind of motivates me a bit more. But I do realise that's not for everyone, and a lot of people who I do speak to say, oh no, complete silence in my own room. I do have my own room. I don't have other people around me. I don't like people talking to me. That does annoy me. But I don't mind music in the background. I don't mind people texting me, because I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm writing. How good is that? You know, show off a little bit. But I appreciate the silence, but I can't work that myself though. But I think everyone to their own though. But it's what you're comfortable with, as Casey quite rightly said. You want chamomile tea? Have it. I'm a glass of wine, but there you go.
Great, thank you. And I'm exactly the same. I can't deal with silence. I get distracted, so you're not alone on that. Ironically, after talking about technology, my laptop's just shut down. So I think the last question of the day was, what advice would you have for yourself when you were just starting out? And if I give that to you, Casey.
Yeah, sure. I had an interesting time with this one when I was looking at the question list that you sent me. I was like, oh goodness, having been doing this for as long as I have, and especially being somebody who's put myself out there for every opportunity, I've had a lot of good opportunities and a lot of bad opportunities come back. So yeah, there were a couple of salient points that I thought I could make on this. I'd say when it comes to facing criticism, it's important to examine its origin and the motivation behind it, and to try and take critiques on an individual basis. Because people love to have an opinion on things, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And I feel like writers, especially writers that I've met and writers that I've coached since, tend to fall into two categories. And there are people who will take every piece of criticism that they are given, and this is especially when they're first starting out, they'll take every piece of criticism and they internalize it as part of their own self-worth. So if it's all good, they're feeling absolutely wonderful, and then somebody will say one thing of like, well, I think you could work on this, and it's I'm never going to write again, I'm awful, everyone hates me. And then you have the other school of thought, which are people that have asked me, what do you think, what's your opinion on this that I wrote? And you know, I'm a teacher, so the first thing that I will do is critique. I will praise and I will critique, because that is the teacher's toolkit. And there are people who will put the walls up completely and say, well, your opinion is completely irrelevant to me. And it's like, well, don't ask for my opinion in the first place. So I think trying to be balanced about critique and looking at people's motivations for why they might be critiquing it, because there's a lot of things that you can brush off the personal taste, and if they didn't like your work, you can say, well, you know, compared to the body of work and the plays and the playwrights that I know this person typically likes, I'm not surprised that they didn't like my work, and that's on them. It's not a reflection of my work. Whereas there are other things where you can think, oh, well, this person's quite experienced in this field, so maybe I could learn from them. So that sort of brings me on to an important point of looking for mentors and figures that can guide you, and people that have already done it. Especially people that are just a few steps ahead of you in the process, because they're still learning as well. So they're not going to know absolutely everything, because you don't really want that energy either. But having a mentor who knows what they're doing and they've been around for a little while, but they're still sort of flexible to new ideas, can be a wonderful shaping tool. If you see other people who are aspiring to the same thing as you, even if they're doing quite badly, keep an eye on them, because you can learn from their mistakes and not make them yourself, which I have had the pleasure of doing during sort of local theatre circles and Amdram and semi-professional theatres, to keep an eye on people and go, oh, well, that was a train wreck, thank you for that, you know, or people who've had a bad experience with a particular like producer or a venue and say, you know, just watch out for these things, there's a lot to learn. And then I think the only other point that I would make on it, forgive me for rambling on the final question, is back to what I said before about owning the worth of your art, because there's so many of us that start out just being grateful to be allowed to put our shows on, but writers are one of the most essential and, in my experience, least valued components of the entertainment industry, which I think is a great shame. So it may be that you know, if you're doing something for a theatre company that is essentially a charity, that's charity based, that there's no monetary remuneration, but that doesn't mean that you can't be properly credited, that you can't be celebrated and compensated in some way, something that they can do to show you that your art has value to them. So I think, you know, be proud of what you're producing, even from the very early stages. If you've got something good and people respond to it well, then you should be able to own the value of it, and you should be valued as a person for what you produce.
Great, thank you. Andy?
In terms of advice, do it because you love it. Do it. I'm going to be far less practical than Casey here, I'm afraid. Do it because you love it. Do it for yourself. If you spend all your time at the keyboard trying to write the sort of stuff that you reckon other people want to be reading, then you're going to miss the mark a lot. Write the stuff that you want to be reading, the stuff that you're passionate about, and that passion will naturally bleed into what you're making. Explore the ideas that matter to you, and just for the sake of trying to give some practical advice there, always try to keep in mind how the end product is going to look to an audience member. It's very easy to be on this side of the looking glass almost and go, well, this is how it looks to me. How's it going to look to an audience member seeing this on stage with people wandering around actually saying it out loud? Kind of keep the logistics in mind and try to think about how you watch plays when you are an audience member.
That's great, thank you so much. And Baz?
Yeah, just to concur what Casey and Andy said, but be proud of what you've achieved, you know. I mean, many years back, I started writing because I enjoyed the idea of writing. It wasn't until like 20 years later that I actually put a play forward. I'm thinking, why did I wait 20 years? You know, that's ridiculous. But it was a hobby. Be proud of what you've done. If you've written a play, how many of your friends have written a play? And it doesn't matter at the start, it's the worst play in the world, because listen to what other people say, as long as it's constructive. If someone says, oh, I don't like that, ignore them. That's not a valuable comment. Why don't they like it? But also remember, you can write the best play in the world. Not everyone is going to like it. You know, you might watch EastEnders. I watch Emmerdale. Why? There's no reason why. It's just the way we enjoy art. Okay, so be proud of what you do. If you've written something, put it out there. Not everyone's going to like it, but that's fine. But as long as you find out constructively what is wrong about it, again, and you don't have to take that advice as well. If you still got a gut instinct, you know, actually, no, I like this idea. This is my passion. Go with it. We all take risks with writing. If you don't take risks, you don't put yourself out there, you could be like me 20 years down the line thinking, oh, maybe I should write something again. You know, so just be aware, not everyone's going to like your work, but as long as you've achieved something and you are proud and happy of what you've done because it's your effort and you've been invested into it and you are pleased with the end result. Yes, you might redraft it. That's fine. That's the next step. But just think, I've done a film script or a 2-act play. Not everyone can say they've done that, you know, so that's your first accomplishment, you know, reap the rewards after that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yeah, that's it for questions. So just again, a really huge thank you to all three of you. And there's been just so much in there that I think is going to be really useful for myself personally and for everyone who watches this. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
For hosting.
All mine.